Thanks to the worship team doing a great job on all those songs this morning. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15 says, "Look after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many." It was 1880 that James Garfield was elected President of the United States. I bet most of you can't name much that happened during his presidency, and that is for the simple reason that after 6 months in office, he was shot in the back with a revolver, and also in the arm. He never lost consciousness, and he was taken quickly to a hospital, and when he was there, the surgeons began probing into the wound, trying to find the bullet. They couldn't find it, so they tried a silver-tipped probe, hoping it would find and locate the bullet, and they were unsuccessful. So they took him by train in a comfortable car, as much as it could be, back to Washington, D.C. Despite the summer heat, they had just developed the first type of air conditioning system that had ever been used, and so it kept the room a little bit cooler for him, but the heat was still making him grow weak. And they were getting desperate. So they reached out to a man who was working on the telephone, known as Alexander Graham Bell, and he had a type of magnet that might help locate the bullet. And they stuck that in there, in the wound, trying to locate the metal inside the president's body. But he failed. The president hung on through July and August, but in September, he finally died. Not from the bullet wound, but from the infection. They didn't understand disease preventative practices at that time. All the fingers that went in him were unwashed and uncleaned. And so the repeated probing of that particular wound eventually killed the president. And so it is with people who dwell too long on wounds in life and refuse to release it to God. When we allow the infection of bitterness to get deep within our souls, it eventually can cause spiritual death and hurt us deeply. All of us struggle with bitterness at one point in time in our lives, at one point or another. Oh, it may not be as major as getting shot by someone or attacked, but I bet you know what it's like to be fired by a boss or let go from a work or to churn on the inside because the coach didn't play you or your child or a classmate who made fun of you. It's interesting. My parents were over this week for Grandparents' Day with Max at preschool, and we were having lunch. After lunch, Dad and I were reminiscing on stories from when we were growing up. And Dad can still remember the student who made fun of him when he preached in preaching class. I said, "That's funny. I can remember the student who made fun of me when I preached in preaching class." Granted, that was 40 years after you, but I can still remember it, and we had a good laugh talking about those people. But it's amazing how long we can hang on to those things and how we don't forget them. Some of you here know what it's like to be abused by a parent, hurt by a coach, slandered by a gossip, snubbed by a friend, maybe overlooked by a church member. And if you're not careful, the root of bitterness will start to grow and harm many, as the Hebrew author warns. Oh, you may not get an automatic weapon or a bomb and go on a killing spree, but you may develop a negative attitude and sour disposition that affects not only you, but every one of the people around you. Jesus teaches that one of the characteristics that defines the Christian is our unique ability to forgive. Jesus said, "When you pray, forgive my trespasses as I forgive those who trespass against me." In Mark 11, Jesus says, "When you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive him, so your Father in heaven may forgive you." Now, if you've ever been hurt deeply, and I mean real deeply, forgiveness can be difficult. As a matter of fact, I would venture to say that there isn't a person in this room who hasn't struggled with this topic at one point in time or another. If you truly have not, you are a unique and blessed individual. And so I want us to personalize this message to our own situations and just see what practical advice God's Word provides for us. Now, for those of you that might have missed the previous week or two here, let me give you a quick overview on the life of Joseph, who we've been studying up to this point. Joseph was abused by his brothers at the age of 17, sold as a slave to Egypt. For 13 years, he was either a slave or a prisoner, and he was treated with great cruelty at times. Now, by God's grace, he's the second most important man in all of Egypt. He collected food during 7 years of great abundance as the crops were doing well, and it was to prepare the world for a famine that would wipe out every bit of success and every bit of prosperity that it had ever known. The famine was worldwide. People came from all over to buy food from Egypt. Egypt became the wealthiest, most powerful nation in the world because Joseph prepared it for this difficult season. Then in Genesis chapter 42, we get to a dramatic moment. See, people are coming to Egypt to buy grain. And some brothers from Canaan come to Egypt to buy grain. And of course, you know who they are. They're Joseph's brothers. And they bow low before Joseph, of course not knowing who Joseph is. And Joseph's dream as a boy came true. Remember when he was a boy, he dreamed that there were these stalks of grain that his brothers, and they all bowed down to him. Joseph and even. I mean, this is time for revenge. His brothers should bow down before him. They don't recognize him. And you say, how do they not recognize him? Well, remember, they sold Joseph as a slave when he was 17. He's now 40 years old. He spoke the Egyptian language. He wore the Egyptian clothes. His body looks different. I'm told that there's some strange thing that happens to a man's body between 17 and 40. Someone once said there are 3 stages to life: youth, middle age, and you're looking good. Some of you might be in that stage right now. I don't know. Joseph had changed. His brothers didn't recognize him anymore. They were bowing down before him. And now he has to figure out, what am I going to do with this situation? Yeah, Kenny was talking about God's grace and how they just started in Dennis' Sunday school class teaching about what's so amazing about grace. Well, Dennis shared a quote with me this week I thought was pretty fitting. And in the class it says, when you feel you are a victim, you have only 2 options. Number 1, get even, or 2, forgive. Those are basically the only 2 options you have when you boil it all down to the most basic essentials when you feel hurt. If you were Joseph, you might remember that you had dreamed those dreams of superiority, that you would be over your brothers. And you would say, now is my chance. After 20 years, I can finally get even. I've waited for this day. Maybe he would say, I'm going to send you home empty-handed. I don't care if you starve to death. Get out of here. He could have made him beg in the dust of the ground. Call me master. That's right. All right, now say you're sorry. Say you're pitiful. He could have put him in prison. He could have tortured him. He could have executed him. Pharaoh would not have questioned any action that Joseph had taken at this point. He could do anything he wanted to do. And you know, that's the case for a lot of people. When the opportunity to get even comes along, you want to take it. It's like the elderly man who was driving a large Lincoln Continental. I mean, a boat of a car, and he was on a crowded street. And just as he found a place to parallel park, he pulled past it to back into it, as you would typically do. But as he was getting ready to back up, a college student with a little sports car zipped in behind him and took the spot. Jumped out of his car, and he said, that's what you can do, Gramps, when you're young and quick. And as he started to walk away, the old man put it in reverse and just started slamming into that car, crunched it up like an accordion, got out of his car. The young kid said, what are you doing? He said, that's what you can do when you're old and rich. Oh, we love stories like that. That's right. Get even with people. Now, maybe we don't bang into people's cars deliberately, but we do have more sophisticated means of getting even. There's legal retaliation. I'll sue you. Oh, how many times have we heard that phrase before? I remember when I first got introduced to the concept, I was watching a movie with Hulk Hogan in it, so you know it wasn't any good. But I do remember the line from the movie where there's these big tough bikers and Hulk Hogan had picked up and moved one of their bikes, and they said, if you scratched one of these, we're going to get you. He says, what are you going to do, pound my face? They said, no, it's the 90s. We're going to sue you. And I still remember that line to this day, and it has definitely carried over the past couple of decades. There's also financial retaliation. You may say, well, how's that work? J. Paul Getty was a billionaire in the oil industry. Married 5 times, had 5 sons. He didn't particularly love any one of them. One of them had been kidnapped, and he refused to pay the ransom to get him back, and so they cut the boy's ear off. By the time of his death, it was reported he changed his will 21 different times because of the broken relationships in his life. There's also verbal retaliation. If you have a verbal skills and have a touch of sarcasm, you can really cut people down in front of others. And then there's the recruitment method, and this is where you get other people to agree with you and to be angry at someone else. We can also retaliate with the cold shoulder. This is probably the most common one that I've seen. And as as a practical level, this is probably the most childish one that we can do, but I think it's the one that's most commonly utilized. If you get angry mad, you just give them the cold shoulder. Not going to pay attention to them anymore. I'll probably see this one in marriage more than any other relationship. You get mad at your spouse, you feel mistreated, so what do? You withhold your affection and attention, and they begin to ask, what's wrong? What's bothering you? And what's the answer?
Nothing.
Some of you have played this game before. Very good. Very good. Or the game's been played at you, whichever, I don't know. Nothing. And after maybe an hour, a day, a week, something is bothering you. Oh, it's nothing. And once you think you've inflicted enough pain in them where they're insecure and they're hurt, then you'll start to open up those lines of communication again. Like I said, that's probably the most childish of them all, but I bet it's the most used. And I would admittedly say that I've used that a time or two, and I have to pray for God's grace in doing that. Heard about an angry wife who vowed to her husband that she was going to dance on his grave. That day he went out and had a prearranged funeral to be buried at sea. There are ways to get even. The motto is simple: you hurt me, I'll hurt you back. Joseph had the perfect opportunity to get even, but he never even tried. Instead, Joseph put his brothers through a series of tests. Some people say this shows Joseph's immaturity, his anger, this is his way of retaliating, and I would disagree with that. It's really interesting to me that Joseph did not immediately reveal himself to his brothers, but he wanted to put them through a series of tests to see if his brothers had changed. Remember, these boys were so jealous of him, they ripped his robe off him, threw him in a pit, sold him as a slave. He wanted to know, were these men different than the boys he grew up with? See, Joseph wanted to provide food for his family, for his father, for his younger brother Benjamin back home. But Joseph needed to know if things had changed. Were they still dishonest? Were they still liars? Were they jealous of Benjamin like they were jealous of him? Joseph didn't want to bless bad men. That's a detriment to society. You know, bad men don't become better by giving them more power, authority, and money. They become worse. See it all the time in the mafia. I just watched a special. I've watched more TV than I care to admit recently in the past 2 months. And there was a special on the Chicago Mafia, Al Capone's outfit. And I wanted to watch this. And the more power he got, the more violent and evil he became. To the point when he was in charge, he would have a table in his hotel where there were 20 of his leaders around it. And he found out one of them had been a snitch, one of them had lied, one of them had given up information to the police. In front of the whole table, he would take a baseball bat and kill them in front of everyone else. Power given to a bad man corrupts them to become even worse. And Joseph didn't want that to be what happened with his brothers. So if these weren't good men, what would happen? Joseph would have to confront them. I mean, he would have to deal with it. But he wanted to first put them through a series of tests to see if, in fact, they were changed. So Joseph demonstrated incredible wisdom and restraint by not revealing himself to his brothers, by not exploding in emotion. Is my father alive? Do you treat Benjamin like you treat me? What did you tell Dad happened to me? Joseph restrains himself. And instead, he puts his brothers through 2 tests. Number 1, there's the test of adversity. The first thing Joseph did was put them through a test that mirrored what he went through with his brothers and going to Egypt. Remember when Joseph went to check on his brothers? They accused him of being a spy and reporting to their father what was going on. Well, now that they're here, Joseph says, you didn't come here to buy grain, you're a spy. And the brothers are freaking out at this point. No, we just want to buy grain. And Joseph ignored their pleas for mercy and threw him in jail. Just like they ignored his pleas for mercy when he was thrown in the pit. He said, you're not here to buy grain, you're here to spy. Genesis 42, picking it up in verse 13. Sir, they said, there are actually 12 of us. We are your servants. Are all your brothers, sons of a man living in the land of Canaan. Right there, Joseph knows his father is alive. He lives. So he's learned a bit of information. They continue. Our youngest brother is back there with our father right now. Now he knows Benjamin is alive. And he also knows Benjamin is receiving favored treatment because he didn't make the trip. He stayed home where it's safe and comfortable. And then they continue. And our one brother is no longer with us. Other translations say he is no more. Oh, they told Jacob Joseph was dead. Now Joseph pretended not to believe him. threw him in prison for 3 days, just as they threw him in the pit. He told them, I'm going to keep you all in prison. I'll let one of you go home, and you can bring your younger brother here. And if you bring your other brother here, I'll let him go. But if you don't, they'll never get out. Then Joseph announced a change of plans. He changed his mind. Was this on the spur of the moment? Was it intentional all along? We don't know. But remember, Joseph's brothers said, we're going to kill him. No, we're going to throw him in a pit and let him starve to death. No, we're going to sell him as a slave. Now he lets them go through that same level of uncertainty with one another. He's going to let them think, okay, we're all in prison. Okay, one of us is in prison. What's going to happen? Simeon was chained up and thrown in prison, and the other brothers were allowed to go. Verse 21, notice the brothers' reaction to the events unfolding. Speaking among themselves, they said, clearly we're being punished because of what we did to Joseph long ago. We saw his anguish when he pleaded for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why we're in this trouble. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy, Reuben asked. Remember, he's the oldest brother who was going to try to save Joseph. But you wouldn't listen, and now we have to answer for his blood. Of course, they didn't know Joseph understood them, for he had been speaking to them through an interpreter. Now he turned away from them and began to weep. I found the conscience is a powerful motivator. 20 years later, they're looking at the mistake they made and they say, God's punishing us for what we did. He's still after us. Edgar Allan Poe wrote one of the most famous short stories, The Telltale Heart. In it, the narrator murders an old man and he buries him beneath the floorboards, but the man pipes out a scream before he dies. Somebody calls the police. The police come by and say they heard something suspicious. And so, and he had buried the old man, like I said, beneath the floorboards of the house. And so he set the two police officers' chairs right above where he buried the old man. They're chatting, they're having tea, just having a wonderful time at 3 in the morning having a chat. But then he begins to hear it. He hears the beating of the old man's heart. And he's starting to sweat. He's starting to get nervous. The police don't act like they hear a thing, but he hears it and he starts freaking out. Finally, he screams, I've had enough. How can you ignore it? And he throws the chairs aside. He rips open the floorboards to show them the beating heart. But in fact, the heart was not beating. The beating he heard was his own heart. The conscience can make us think very deeply about stuff that's happened in our lives. The brothers carried guilt for 20 years. What pain is to the body, guilt is to the spirit. Guilt reveals a need in our spiritual lives. Joseph's brothers felt guilt. But then there's a second test that takes place, and that's the test of prosperity. See, they had demonstrated repentance when the pressure was on. And how will they handle things when everything went well? So they returned to Canaan, and then they ran out of food again, and that Jacob was going to send them to buy more grain. Now here's what's interesting. As soon as Jacob learns that Simeon's in chains, he doesn't immediately go down there to get him. He leaves them until they run out of food. How much food did they buy? Was it enough for a month? 6 months? A year? We don't know. But if you're Simeon, you're probably not too happy at this point. You're probably pretty upset. You think they've abandoned you. They've left you to die. He could probably best relate to Joseph of any of the brothers. But the brothers tell their father, we can't go back without Benjamin. Jacob says, no, I don't. I've already lost Joseph. I've lost Simeon. I don't want to lose Benjamin too. But finally, because they are starving. Now remember, Jacob was wealthy. But money is not the best source of nutrition for your body, okay? If there is no food to buy, your money doesn't do very good. So they had to go back to Egypt with Benjamin to get food and to get their brother. Now this time when they arrived in Egypt, it's a little bit different. Last time they were accused of being spies and thrown in prison. This time, he told his chief servant to take the men, and of course nobody knows these are Joseph's brothers, to his home, which is a palace. And then in the palace, he's going to have a banquet for them. And so they get there, they prepare it. The brothers are scared because when they went home the first time, the money they used to buy the grain was in their sacks. And they told the servant, we didn't take this. It was must have been a mistake. We want to pay for the grain we bought the first time. And the servant says, oh, it was God's graciousness that gave that to you. It was God's gift. Just count it as a blessing. So Joseph arrives home at noon. They prepare the banquet. They present him with special gifts. Joseph asked how their old father was getting along. And they said, oh, he's good. Then he walked up to Benjamin and said, is this the younger brother you spoke about? And they said, yes, it is. And Joseph said, God be with you. God be gracious to you. Then he went back to his private room to weep. He was so overcome with emotion. He actually had to wash his face and probably have his makeup redone, as that was very common in Egyptian culture. he returned and called for the meal to be served. Now, it's interesting that the Egyptians would not eat at the same table with the Hebrews. They looked down on them. They were despised. And so they had separate tables. But Joseph arranged where each brother would sit. And it says they were amazed. He sat them in birth order. How would this Egyptian know the birth order? But the time came to eat. And Joseph also arranged that Benjamin would receive 5 times as much food as anyone else. Now, I don't know how it works in your home, but if you try to give one of your kids more food than the others, in our house, for example, there's only one person who does not like ice cream, and that's Owen. He does not like it. He does not eat it, wants nothing to do with it. Maybe he's adopted and we forgot. I don't know. But he doesn't like ice cream. So if we would ever go to a restaurant and the only dessert option they have is ice cream, and we would actually buy dessert, he's not the happiest camper in the world. And he begins to ask, well, what do I get? Well, you can have another cheeseburger, okay? I don't know. What do you want? And he's like, well, when we go home, can I at least have a piece of candy? I don't want them having ice cream while I get nothing. And that's kind of Owen's approach to it. And so we sometimes say, you either enjoy what they have or you get nothing, or sometimes we're really nice and let them have a Kit Kat or something. I don't know. But he wants to be treated equally with everyone else. And I think everybody wants that. We like the idea of equality. And Benjamin is given 5 times as much as all the other brothers. And notice the brothers are not critical or resentful. They just enjoy their meal, carrying on, having a good time. So after the meal, Joseph sends them on their way. Simeon is released. They're given grain. And then they're stopped at the city limit by the police. And the police say, how can you repay kindness with evil? You stole our master's favorite cup from the palace. Now the brothers are shocked and scared, but they also know they didn't steal the cup. They didn't do anything wrong. And so they tell the police, search all of our sacks of grain. If you find the cup, then you can execute the one who did it, and you can enslave the rest of us. What they did not know was Joseph had already planted the cup, or had the cup planted in Benjamin's sack. And so they start with the oldest brother, work their way down, and they find the silver cup. And the police say, the rest of you can go home, but this boy will be a slave. Now the brothers are upset at this point. They could have gone home. Remember, the selfish brothers before would have done just that. But they say, we can't leave Benjamin. They tear their clothes, which is a sign of mourning at that time. They load up their donkeys and they return to the palace. And when they get before Joseph, Judah speaks up for the brothers. And he says, we'll all be your slaves, not just Benjamin. So Judah's saying, hey, if he's going to be here, we're all going to be here. And Joseph says, that would be wrong for me to enslave all of you for the one man's sin. No. And then Judah speaks up again. And he says, my father's favorite wife had 2 sons. One of them is no more, Joseph, and one of them is Benjamin. If he stays here as a slave, this will kill our father. He will die. And so Judah says, I have a proposal. Let Benjamin go home with the others, and I will take his place as a slave. It's really interesting that years later, a couple thousand years later, 1,500 years later, there would be one who came from the tribe of Judah who would also take the place of sinful man on the cross. Judah says, let me take the place of the boy. Let me be a slave instead. We turn to chapter 45, get the first verse. Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, out, all of you. So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. He broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. When you've been incredibly hurt, when that boil is lanced and that pressure is finally released, it can be incredibly emotional. The brothers are dumbfounded at this point. Why is this Egyptian ruler weeping like this? And they don't get it. Why is he crying? And then in verse 3, Joseph speaks. I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Must be in Hebrew at this point. He sent out all of his attendants. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. So the brothers are terrified to find out their brother is still alive. The one they beat up, threw in the cistern, and sold as a slave. Good reason for fear, because now he has all the authority in the world to do whatever he wants to them. And you know, I think for these brothers, what they're experiencing is what others will experience the day they stand before Jesus. the Jesus they didn't believe in, the Jesus they ridiculed, the Jesus whose name they used in vain. They're going to look up, and this man is going to say, I am Jesus. And then they will understand the meaning that every knee will bow. Picking it up in verse 4. Please come closer, he said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, I am Joseph, your brother whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Now, I don't think God prearranged for Joseph's brothers to be cruel to him. I don't think God ever prearranges anything like that. It's in James that we read, when one is tempted, one should not say, God is tempting me, because God tempts no man. Man is not a puppet that God forces to do evil. But God does know our tendencies, and He does know the actions we will take. And He knows that He can take any bad situation that happens in our life and work it out for good. Verse 14, weeping with joy, he embraced Benjamin, and Benjamin did the same. Then Joseph kissed each of his brothers and wept over them. And after that, they began talking freely with him. After this reunion, Pharaoh orders Joseph to have the whole family move down to Egypt. Joseph sends the brothers back, sends a cart back. They tell Jacob. Jacob can't believe it at first, and then he's amazed to learn his son's alive. He went from disbelief to joy in a matter of moments, and he traveled to Egypt. And Joseph was so gracious to everyone. I think there are 3 lessons we need to learn about Joseph and the forgiveness he displayed. Number 1 is this: forgiveness releases my right to retaliate forever. Forgiveness releases my right to retaliate forever. Joseph had been mistreated and had the opportunity to retaliate multiple times, but he didn't do it. Now, maybe there's an injustice in your life. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it relates to. And you have the power to get even. But if you have forgiven that person, you have given up that power. If there's any punishment to be administered, forgiveness means God will handle it. Romans says, leave room for God's wrath. God will repay. But sometimes we do like to take it in our own hands, don't we? I used to love listening to talk radio a whole lot. I don't listen to it as much anymore as I'm not in the car as much. But I love listening to John Carney. He's a national radio guy, and he tells a lot of funny stories. And he told a story when he was in high school. He was a freshman, and they were getting out of the school parking lot. And as a couple upperclassmen were coming in their big truck, he whipped in front of them with his car and flipped them off as they honked their horn and took off. And he got stopped at a stoplight. Well, the truck pulled up behind him. The 2 guys got out, pulled him out of the car, and roughed him up. Kind of high school roughing him up. Not anything permanent, but they just taught him this is how you respect upperclassmen. Well, he went home, licking his wounds that night, and his parents sent him out to the store. Well, as they did, he noticed a local hangout, and that truck was parked in front of the local hangout. And he remembered the beating he got that afternoon. And so he thought, what can I do about this? Just so happened he had a toolbox in his car. And he happened to find 4 screwdrivers in that toolbox. And he went behind each tire and propped screwdrivers against them. Then he went and he parked his car in a dark part where nobody could see it, and he waited for the 2 kids to come out. They came out, and they backed their truck up to 4 flat tires. And he said he laughed, and he felt so good. And he told that story on the radio, and that was it. There was no moral of the story. There was no nothing. And when I first heard it, I kind of laughed, and then I thought, getting even might make you feel good for a moment. But if you've forgiven someone, you've released that right. Truly, he hadn't forgiven them. He wanted to get even. But God tells us to give it to Him. Let Him handle the situation. And that's hard to do. But we need to remember, it's not our job to make people pay. God's a big enough God to handle that. Second truth on forgiveness. I will do my part. I will do my part. Forgiveness is not just turning a situation over to God and walking away from another person. It's doing my part to build bridges with other people. Now, we cannot control other people's actions or feelings, how they will respond and what they will do. But we need to do our part to mend broken relationships. We don't concern ourselves with possible responses. We do what's right. Notice how Joseph did that. He gave them the opportunity to demonstrate repentance. Also, there's a difference between forgiveness and trust. I think we need to go down this rabbit trail very briefly. You can forgive someone, but they still have not built credibility in your life. If a girl's engaged to a guy and he cheats on her, she should forgive him. But I don't recommend that she marry him next month. If someone steals money out of your wallet, I recommend you forgive them. But don't let them hold your wallet for you while you go do something else. Joseph gave the brothers a chance to prove they deserved trust again. So he initiated this exchange of kindnesses with them through these different tests. Eventually he told them the truth, wept openly, and then he embraced them. Romans 12 says, don't repay evil for evil. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. I don't know who this quote is attributed to, but someone once said, we're most like beasts when we kill, most like man when we judge, and we're most like God when we forgive. Do your part. Third, I acknowledge God's control in the situation. Joseph said, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Forgiveness has really reached maturity when you can look back and say, God saw me through that thing. And for Joseph, it took 20 years to be able to say that. But that's when forgiveness is complete. One of the greatest quotes you'll ever read on forgiveness comes from Lewis Smedes. To forgive is to set a prisoner free, only to finally discover that prisoner was you. Now, it's very possible this morning you're thinking, but Mark, you don't know how hurt I've been. You don't know what I've been through. And you are absolutely right. Most of your situations, I have no idea what you've been through and how deep the hurt is. But I doubt your hurt is as deep as Corrie ten Boom's. She was arrested and mistreated by the Nazis, hauled off to Ravensbrück concentration camp in World War II. Her sister Betsy died there, and she was released at the end of the war. And she was speaking at a church in Munich. And it's going to take 3 minutes. So I would ask that you just focus in on these words as I read her own words from her biography. It was in a church in Munich that I saw him, a balding, heavy-set man in a gray overcoat, a brown felt hat clutched between his hands. People were filing out of the basement room where I had just spoken, moving along the rows of wooden chairs to the back door. It was 1947, and I had come from Holland to defeated Germany with the message that God forgives. It was the truth they needed to hear most in that bitter, bombed-out land, and I gave them my favorite mental picture. Maybe because the sea is never far from a Hollander's mind, I like to think that's where God throws forgiven sins. When we confess our sins, I told them, God cast them into the deepest ocean, gone forever. The solemn faces stared back at me, not quite daring to believe. There were never questions after a talk in Germany in 1947. People stood up in silence. In silence, they collected their wraps, and in silence, they left the room. And that's when I saw him, working his way forward against the others. One moment, I saw the overcoat and the brown hat, and the next, a blue uniform and a visor cap with its skull and crossbones. And it came back in a rush. The huge room with its harsh overhead lights, the pathetic pile of dresses and shoes in the center of the floor, the shame of walking naked past this man. I could see my sister's frail form ahead of me, ribs sharp beneath the parchment skin. Betsy, how thin you were. Betsy and I had been arrested for concealing Jews in our home during the Nazi occupation of Holland. This man had been a guard at Ravensbrück concentration camp where we were sent. Now he was in front of me, and he thrust out a hand. A fine message. How good it is to know that, as you say, all our sins are at the bottom of the sea. And I, who had just spoken so glibly of forgiveness, fumbled in my pocketbook rather than take that hand. He would not remember me, of course. How could he remember one prisoner among the thousands of women? But I remember him, and the leather crop swinging from his belt. It was the first time since my release that I had been set face to face with one of my captors, and my blood seemed to freeze. You mentioned Ravensbrück in your talk, he said. I was a guard there. Ah, no, he did not remember me. But since that time, he went on, I've become a Christian. I know that God has forgiven me for the cruel things I did there, but I would like to hear it from your lips as well. And again the hand came out. Will you forgive me? And I stood there. I, whose sins had every day to be forgiven, and I could not. Betsy had died in that place. How could he erase her slow and terrible death simply for asking? It could not have been many seconds that he stood there, hand held out, but it seemed hours as I wrestled with the most difficult thing I ever had to do. For I had to do it. I knew that. The message that God forgives us has a prior condition, that we forgive those who injured us. Jesus says, if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses. I knew it not only as a commandment of God, but as a daily experience. Since the end of the war, I had a home in Holland, for the victims of Nazi brutality. Those who were able to forgive their former enemies were able to return to the outside world and rebuild their lives, no matter the physical scars. But those who nursed their bitterness remained invalids. It was as simple and horrible as that. We're getting to the conclusion here. And still I stood there, with the coldness clutching my heart. But my forgiveness is not an emotion. I knew that too. Forgiveness is an act of the will, and the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. Jesus, help me, I prayed silently. I can lift my hand. I can do that much. You supply the feeling. And so woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one stretched before me. And as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder, and it raced down my arm and sprang into our joined hands. And then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, brother, I cried, with all my heart. Last sentence, last two sentences. For a long moment, we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner, and I had never known God's love so intensely as I did then. As the worship team joins me on stage, let me read Paul's words in Colossians 3. Make allowance for each other's faults. Seems like Paul expects people to mess up. Interesting. Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. For as members of one body, you are called to live in peace. Because God has forgiven us, we can and ultimately must forgive others. Paul Harvey once said the Christian life is one of obedience, not partnership. This morning, I'm grateful Jesus made forgiveness with God a possibility and a reality. In Micah 7:19, God says He's hurled all our sins into the depths of the sea. But if you've not experienced that kind of forgiveness this morning, I want you to do that by meeting me down front.